Fair warning, this video discusses death, bullying, and gun violence. This is the specter that has hung over my head ever since I started the Death in Degrassi series. This is the storyline that most people will think of whenever they think of Degrassi. In their own rights, Claude's and Wheels' parents' deaths were paradigm shifts, but not in the way like Rick Murray's was. This really changed Degrassi, in-universe, and people's perceptions of it. To me, this one of the definitive moments of the phrase, "it goes there." This death in particular has a lot of build-up and a lot of aftermath, so I'm going to have to split up into two videos, talking about the before and the shooting in this one, and then all the rest in the second one. Rick Murray was not liked at his school. Hell, it's safe to say that he was rather hated. But not because he was a brainer, rather odd, and a bit socially inept, but because he put a fairly well-liked person in the hospital. In season 3, he was introduced as Terri's first boyfriend, and Terri's abusive boyfriend at that. When she tried to give him a second chance against her friend's wishes, he took his anger on her and put her in a coma. And after that incident, Rick disappeared from Degrassi, until he decided to come back partway through season 4. As he explained it, he wanted to come back to Degrassi because he liked it there, and partially to show people that he had changed. He was in counseling trying to rein in his anger, but that wasn't really convincing to most. For Spinner and Paige, their friend was put in a coma by this guy. There was some residual self-loathing because they let Terri go off alone with a known abuser, but then also anger directed at Rick that they could never act on because he was quickly pulled out of school after that. And now he had the audacity to walk back into Degrassi as if nothing happened? No, they weren't going to let him be at Degrassi without being reminded what he did to their friend. For Alex, once an abuser, always an abuser. She watched her mom go through similar things as Terri did. As she would later point out, she would sometimes end up icing her mom's lips, listen to her crying herself to sleep, and lived her life in and out of women's shelters. She couldn't fight her mom's boyfriends, but she could give this guy, this abuser in her own school, what she wanted to give the men who hurt her mom. Show them that she's not going to tolerate this, especially not in her own school. And for Emma, well, it's kinda hard to say why she at first got on the bandwagon of making Rick's life hell. Part of it definitely was that she didn't at all agree with what Rick had done last year, and the school refusing to kick Rick out definitely fueled the need to do something on her own. But I think also part of it was that she was rather friendless at the moment. Because of her pettiness over her breakup with Chris, Liberty and Manny were no longer talking to her. But an easy end with Paige's friend group was to take up this cause that she thought was righteous too, hence the silent protest, aiming to fight against violence. A pretty thinly veiled attack on Rick. Emma didn't really foresee what it would become. Through the cause, people were encouraged to not just bully him, but commit acts of violence against him. Something that a cause against violence should technically also be against. Pushing him into lockers, tripping him in the hallways, even eventually leading to him getting beaten up outside the dot. And though Emma did lose her newfound friend group because of it, she did eventually try to put a stop to the violence against Rick when she saw it was going too far. A debate that always occurs when this plotline is discussed is, did Rick deserve it? And of course, Rick deserves some punishment for what he did to Terri. It was terrible, and no one deserves to be abused by their significant other. And because the system didn't seem to be punishing Rick, it's understandable that the students thought that they had to take it into their own hands. But something that I think we need to take into account is the fact that Rick was trying to get better. He was trying to be better. He was in counseling. He was trying to turn the other cheek when people would hit him. I think the fact that he's aiming for rehabilitation should be taken into account. No, Paige, Spinner, and everyone else were not obligated to be his friend. But I think at a certain point, the bullying just becomes torture. The punishment stops being retribution for the crime and turns into abuse itself. Kind of like what often happens in prisons, especially here in the US. And unfortunately, this mob justice turned into one of the biggest tragedies of Degrassi history. Of course, this isn't to say that Rick wasn't responsible for his actions. He could have chose not to come back to the school with a gun. But you can't deny that there was build-up to this point. Rick was bottling up his anger with every push and punch thrown at him. And it's not like he didn't try to be happy and move on. We had silly and lighthearted moments with him, like Rick and Toby's bet. It was charming to watch them get to do something so high school, something so silly as get the most kisses by the end of the day. Of course, I'm bothered by the way Rick talked about girls, but it was still a cute episode nonetheless. I don't know if Jay was being truthful when he said that a Niner girl was being stalked. It seemed more to me that the fact that she gave him a kiss was enough to try to punish Rick or Toby. When Rick said that the kiss gave him the motivation he needed, I think what he was talking about was to pursue Emma romantically. As we saw with him and Emma, he easily mistakes being nice as romantic gestures and flirting, but I don't think he took that from Darcy's kiss. And then everything came to a head at the quiz team finals. At that point, Rick was starting to retaliate against his tormentors, i.e. by spray painting black X's on their cars. Part of me thinks that the reason why he found the courage to do so was things were kind of starting to go his way. I mean, a lot of people were still making his life a living hell at school, but he had the quiz team, Emma, who he thought loved him, and Toby, who was his geeky friend. And he found a place where his talents and knowledge was appreciated. And what made it better was Jimmy was starting to turn to his side, or at least was recognizing that Rick isn't necessarily the absolute worst. He's done bad, but the torture has gone on long enough. Things were starting to look up for Rick. Hell, even Jay and Spinner said that they were cool. But then, the paint and feathers fell, ruining what was supposed to be the height of Rick's young life. The people who were making his life hell the whole year had stolen away his victory. Emma tried to comfort him, but then his delusion of her supposed flirting with him finally came to a head. It's a terribly haunting moment to see him standing alone in the hallway, paint and feathers, trophy in hand, especially knowing what's about to happen next. But even more frightening is when he returns to school, clutching his backpack, and tells Toby that for once he actually wants to be there. And it's then that we realize that he really didn't have a good support system. Sure, Raditch was going ballistic trying to find who did this to him, but that wasn't consolation. And when he got home, neither his mom or dad were there. He was stuck alone with his thoughts and anger that has been building since the beginning of the year. And like in season 3 with Terri, his anger exploded and he turned to the one thing that he did when he couldn't cope with his thoughts: violence. This was something that could have been avoided. And I'm not saying, oh, if they just didn't bully him, or if Rick didn't return to Degrassi. No, unbeknownst to them, what put Rick over the edge was Spinner and Jay. Hell, it almost didn't happen. When Rick went to Paige, his first target, she unknowingly diffused the situation by telling him that even though they're not the best of friends, the paint and feathers thing was totally juvenile. And Rick heard this. He immediately softened and finally got his chance to apologize for what he did to Terri, and Paige actually heard it. We get the sense that even though Paige won't be his friend, she at least won't torment him in the halls anymore. Then Jay and Spinner had to ruin it. Even though Alex, Jay, and Spinner were all in on the paint and feathers thing, Jay and Spinner, in fear of Jimmy ratting to Raditch about what they'd done, that they and Alex were involved in the paint and feathers prank, they put the bug in Rick's ear that Jimmy was the one who set it up. That he had purposely betrayed Rick so that he would be humiliated in one of the best moments of his life. And then all that anger came back. Next thing we know, Rick is confronting Jimmy in the hallway, and Jimmy has no idea what's about to happen. At that point, Rick wouldn't listen to him. Spinner and Jay had poisoned his mind against Jimmy. It's a terribly frightening moment when we see Jimmy starting to see where the conversation was turning, him trying to act cool in the face of a gun, but then finally breaking into a run when he saw that Rick was serious. The moment where Jimmy gets shot is one of the best examples of deafening silence. The background noise cuts away. There is no music. There's only the gunshot and Jimmy's cries. There's no background music afterwards either. As Craig sees his friend fall into the ground, as people vacate the hallways and Rick silently stalks, sort of in a daze. It's almost fitting that Sean was there and the one to try to talk him down. He, best of all people, knew the consequences of trying to take revenge on the people who hurt you. He deafened a kid trying to defend himself. It's so hard to watch him try to plead with Rick, get him to understand the gravity of what he was about to do. It also says something about him, the fact that he was able to keep mostly composed in the face of someone with a gun. And in this moment also, we see that either Rick has regressed or he wasn't fully rehabilitated from what happened with Terri. Today, we would call his thought process pretty typical nice guy logic. He perceived Emma's niceness and pitying to be flirting and basically trying to lead him on. And because Emma didn't feel the same way for him, he blamed her. She made his kill list for this. And I can't even begin to imagine what Toby must have felt watching his friend walk the halls with a gun and point it at one of his friends. It pains you to listen to Toby cry out as Sean and Rick wrestled for the gun. And the next thing we know, it's over. We don't learn until later that Rick died from the shot. How we're left hanging for a little while as to if the gun hit anyone. The rest of the episode is quite a daze. Everything is unsettled. Like the characters, we're still in shock. Up with the moments that I listed before, another one that hits home is when Hazel hears that there was a shooting at the school and notices that Jimmy isn't there. It had to be Jimmy who was shot. This scene really makes me wish that Andrea Lewis got to do more in the series. Her acting is superb. Your heart breaks along with hers as Miss Sauvé tells her the terrible news. Last week I made a video about whether or not Mr. Raditch ignored Rick. I've had some time to think about what you guys in the comments have said, and rewatching some of the footage that I'd missed in my watch through for that video, I think it's a little bit of both. In some ways, his hands were tied. He only really could be reactionary to the things that were happening to Rick. But I think Mr. Simpson was also right. They weren't taking the bullying seriously enough. In a deleted scene, Mr. Raditch saw Spinner making fun of Rick after the paint and feather thing. And what did Mr. Raditch do considering what had just happened to poor Rick? He told Spinner to be at his office at 3:30 for a little talk. The scene especially gives credence to Mr. Simpson's position that they didn't take Rick's bullying seriously. I mean, a school can only do so much, but it would seem that they still could have done more than they tried. And if Simpson and his other teachers were reporting the fact that Rick was getting tormented in the hallways, Raditch should have listened to Rick. Of course, Rick had a weird way of stating things, describing his issues with Jimmy as Jimmy not liking him and having no qualms about stating just that. But the fact that Rick was coming to him and knowing how the other students felt about Rick really should have been a red flag for Mr. Raditch. I think Mr. Raditch really has gotten the short end of the stick in TNG, but it's not unbelievable. He's been in the profession for about 20 years now, and principal for quite a while. He doesn't quite have the same warmth that he did when he started out, and he's probably become quite jaded when dealing with students. Issues that he once took seriously, he now sees as rather petty. At this point, he needed reminders like in season 3 to remember that these kids are people and should be treated as such. He's been rather wrapped up in his own issues and stopped putting credence in the troubles of the students who walk his hallways. He couldn't necessarily kick Rick out of school, especially because, as he says in a deleted scene, he's not been charged with anything. But he knew that people didn't want him at Degrassi. That should have at least been the catalyst to doing something more. Hindsight is 20/20. Of course, now we know that Rick was troubled, but as Mr. Simpson points out, why only wait to look at the warning signs after the tragedy has occurred? Something else that a lot of people bring up whenever talking about this two-parter is the B plot. Joey trying to sell his house and Caitlin trying to save it. Yeah, it's not the best story that the writers have ever written. It's not really up there with any of the top ones either. It's middling at best, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons why most people dislike it. It has interesting character moments for Caitlin and Joey, especially when Sydney, Joey's ex, is brought in the mix. But I strongly suspect that any B-plot in this two-parter would suffer by simply being in these episodes. There needed to be quiet moments to contrast the drama and the intense action that was happening in the A-plot, and I feel that anything that they put in there, whenever we switched to it, we'd always be anxious to go back to what was happening with Rick in the shooting. Part of me likes its placement though, because it sort of reminds you that mundane things happen even around the most exciting of situations. Life doesn't stop. Even when there's a shooting in one part of the world, in the same city, there's just people going about their daily life. Before I go, there's one sequence that I'd like to give light to. It's magnificent in how depressing it is. It's after we learn that Rick died and seeing all the characters in the immediate aftermath. Spinner having to deal with the gravity of what he helped cause, the different families watching this high school that we've come to know and love on the evening news for something so terrible. The sequence always makes me want to cry, partially because of the amazing song choice, but also because, again, that daze of where do we go from here? What happens now? How do you live in the wake of such a tragedy? It's still hard to say how much Raditch could have done because Rick's death was really a comedy of errors. Yes, he was a ticking time bomb, a pretty messed up person without a support system at home or at school, and even though in the end it was his decision to shoot Jimmy and attempt to shoot Emma, other people made some choices too. His bullies kept on him even long past when it stopped being punishment and became torture. Alex Jane Spinner set up the paint and feathers prank to publicly humiliate him. And then out of fear of getting told on, Jay and Spinner making it as though Jimmy was the one to set up the prank. This was really a turning point for Degrassi, and most of the characters who were involved with the shooting. There was just so much fallout from this that I can't really contain it in one video. Next time I return to Death in Degrassi, I'll discuss basically the rest of Season 4 and going into Season 5, 6, quite a while, because that's just how far the aftermath reaches in the show. Rick may be gone, but his effects are still there, as are the choices that the characters that I have talked about have made. I think one of the best things that this storyline did was show that Rick was a person. We got to empathize with him, but also see the terrible things that he did and know that they were wrong. Thank you very much for consuming this video, and if you want to talk to me about just about anything, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. You can find me at NotAVampyre. Again, thank you very much for consuming this video, and until part 2.